Our next speaker, well known to many of us, is Jon Gibb from the Lochy District Salmon Fishery Board. Amongst other things, he manages the River Lochy, which is a poor suffering west coast river, but also manages one of the largest wild salmon hatcheries in Scotland. And so what he has to say is very much relevant to what's going on here, and maybe will provide something of a balance against some of the objections to hatcheries which we've been hearing about so far. Jon.
Thank you, David. Is that working all right? I didn't like what just came up there on the thing. It looks like we might lose some slides, so I'll try and make this as smooth as possible. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, I'm Jon Gibb. I feel a little bit like, I think it's sort of David and Goliath here. I am a fishery manager. I'm not an academic. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a geneticist. I guddle about with fish on rivers. In fact, I should be in my hatchery right at the moment, not standing here with a microphone in my hand. But I hope what I can show from a very, very small example. We're coming right down in scale here. We've just had a presentation from a whole country there. We're now down to one single river on the west coast of Scotland, and not a lot of data to show from it. But I've got something, and I think we can maybe inform the debate a little bit. I certainly hope so. And any questions later on, I'm also here with my colleague Jon Veach, who's the river manager. I'm just the restoration manager. They've hired me to try and restore the stock, but Jon's the river manager. So Jon can also, you can fire questions at him as well. Anyway, let's see if we can work this thing. Yeah, this is where I work. This is Lochy, if you don't already know it. It's a fair chunk of the west coast of Scotland. It's got 32 rivers of significance, and the Lochy is the main one of it. I'm going to move through this fairly quickly because I want to get on to results later on. I don't have long. Here we are, the Lochy, nestled lovely below Ben Nevis. John Ashley Cooper said the Lochy is the queen of Scottish salmon rivers, and who would be I to disagree with that? I'm entirely biased, but I think it's got some of the best fly fishing in Scotland. It really is the most wonderful river. We've got 9 miles of prime fly fishing for salmon on 38 named pools, so it's a very short river. But it is the bottom end of a very, very large catchment, I should say. Socio-economics, very important. We support 3 full-time equivalent jobs and 5 part-time equivalent jobs. We've got 200 local anglers that fish the river who are passionate about the river. They've seen it through thick and thin. And we've got 300 visiting anglers to the private beats on the river. And we reckon approximately we're bringing in about £500,000 to the local economy from fishing. As you can see below, it's the most productive river on the west coast of Scotland, certainly over the last 10 years. I don't know if you can read that table that shows you that. It's also quite unusual for a west coast river, the Lochy. It's not only quite large, but it also has quite a long season in terms of runs. So we have a significant spring run all the way through to the autumn fish. So from that point of view, it's quite unusual in terms of west coast rivers. Not alone, but quite unusual. Right, that's enough of the selling of the river. Here, let's look at reality. Here we have the rod catch for the Lochy, the 9 miles of fishing. You can see that in the good old days of high marine survival, we were catching 1,500, even 2,000 fish to the rods, and the river started to decline, as you can see, in the early 90s, to the point that in 1998, the fishing effort didn't decline dramatically then, but all they managed was 32 fish from a peak of 2,000. So you can see it was an extreme collapse. What we've seen is a partial recovery out of that, and I'm going to get onto that bit a bit later on. But that's the overall picture of what we're talking about on the Lochy. It's no secret to anyone, and everybody in this room, I'm quite sure, will know about this relationship, the relative performance of the east coast of Scotland relative to the west coast of Scotland. We'll all have our views on why that could be the case, but that's just to put up some ROFS data there to show that the Lochy is very much like other west coast rivers. It has not performed in the same way as east coast rivers at all. And in fact, that graph is not up to date, and it becomes even more extreme, actually, the gap between the two. Nice picture of a fish, right? My point here is really, and I'm not going to go into each one of these, my point here is that, okay, so we're underperforming relative to the east, but the reasons for that will be many. We might think there's only one. I think you know which one I'm talking about, but it's not the only one. And I'll just I'll blot out that nice salmon with all the potential local impacts. And as I said, I'm not going to go through each of them. We all know about this. We've got a river full of brown trout. We never had that before. We've got climate change factors, all the ones, they've already been talked about today, but we do see that a lot. We've got hydro heavily impacting the catchment, and when we combine hydro with the climate change factors, we're seeing even more impact from them. In the estuary, we've got a lack of feeding, I believe, for migrating smolts. I'll just briefly mention that one. In 1984, we signed up, the Inshore Fisheries Act was signed, and that allowed trawlers and dredgers to come into the 3-mile zone, as you probably know. Now, the impact that could easily have had, and I believe it has had, on the prey species and the habitat of prey species for salmon and sea trout was probably significant. When fish farming's come along, we've forgotten about all that. But actually that, I believe, was a very, very seminal moment in the West Coast. When the smolt goes to sea, it needs a high-octane meal, and the West Coast has to find its way out of the estuary. It's not like East or North Coast, it's straight out into the sea. It's got to manoeuvre out of all the estuaries, and it needs that meal, and it's perfectly possible they're not finding that meal. We've done no work on this at all, well, significant work to my knowledge. Increase in predators, we could have talked all day about seals, and at the bottom, fish farms. At last, we're onto it. Escapes and interbreeding, I'll not go into the details of these. Disease transfer, the interruption of the salmon's scenting and homing ability. I was very interested in some comments that David made in his presentation about this. We now know to a degree that salmon can scent other fish. It's one of the mechanisms they can use to find their way home, and specifically to their spawning stream. I wonder what happens when we put 1 million fish here and 1 million fish there and 1 million fish there, and all the pheromone that comes off these fish. I was speaking to a Norwegian last week about this, and he was saying that where they have discharges from land-based fish farms, they're finding the salmon are congregating at the discharges of fish farms. It's a very interesting point, but it's not appropriate to dwell on it right at the moment. I'm not here to talk about that, even if I did know something about it. But the bottom one is infestation of smolts by sea lice, and I stress smolts by sea lice. I'm not talking about adult infestation by sea lice. I'm talking about things that size getting sea lice on them. As we can see here. This is a serious problem for us. We do not believe it is the only problem. Please don't get me wrong on this. But there is a very good reason why we have concentrated on this over the years. One of them is this. It's the location of our river. It's a bit messy, this map, I'm afraid. The bit on the right, this is the, I don't know how to use this, but we can see there's the River Lochy coming into its estuary, Loch Linney and the Sound of Mull. The map on the left shows you that a smolt leaving the River Lochy can pass 17 fish farms on its way to sea. I don't believe there's certainly anything like that density of fish farms anywhere else in Scotland, so it's unique in that respect. It's also a long, thin estuary, and absolutely critically, it points in a southwesterly direction, so it faces the prevailing wind. So what happens when you get smolts billowing out of these fish farms? A lot of them will basically just get blown upstream, up the estuary, and we've got, at the river mouth there, a congregation of sea lice. It's why it's one of the best sea lice sampling points in the whole of Scotland. But 17 different fish farms, I just want people to remember that as we go on. And to put it in some context, one of these fish farms contains more fish than are caught by rod and net in the entire North Atlantic region. That's one. We've got 17. This has been some superb work done at that river mouth that I'm talking about, at the mouth of the Lochy over 10 years by the Lochaber Fishery Trust. What it shows, and I'm going to stress this is on post-smolt sea trout. It's not on salmon. We can't trap the salmon and do the same work. So that's an important distinction. However, what it shows clearly, shows a number of things, but it shows that every other year you get very, very high numbers of sea lice. Now, we've shown that corresponds directly with fish farm production cycles. So when the fish are in the second year in the farms, they're bigger and they have more parasites. When the fish are in the first year, the fish are much smaller, obviously less parasites. So that's the first thing, the up-down cycle that you get. And the second thing is in the up cycles, we're showing that about, or at least half of the fish have potentially lethal loads of sea lice. And if we actually put a line in next, work was done to show possible lethal levels of sea lice on smolts, and we think that's around 12 to 15 smolts per fish. is we start to see that basically what we have concluded from this, although it is on sea trout, we've concluded that this suggests that up to 50% of wild smolts may be facing a lethal threat in the estuary at least every other year during their seaward migration. And this is only sampling from one site as well. So this is a good example of how management is being informed by really, really good monitoring by our fishery trust. And just in passing, I'm going to show you another monitoring site. It's actually just around the corner in Lochy. This is where we had a fish farm that was relocated. You can see there when it was relocated. And you see a number of things. Two things are lost. The high lice numbers are lost, and the up-down cycle is lost. So this seems to be telling us, or at least suggesting to us, where the problem is coming from. So that was what we were faced with. And as a manager, that's what I'm faced with practically on a daily basis. So can we remove this bottleneck to smolt survival and relocate the 17 fish farms in Loch Linnhe and the Sound of Mull? Well, let's look at the facts rather than what we'd like to do. We've got different companies involved operating different farms on different production cycles. Not just one company I can go and speak to and say, look what you're doing here. You know, it's all sorts of companies out there and different. It's complex from that point of view. We've got some of the largest production units in the whole of Scotland are found in this estuary. As I said before, I used the example of the rod and net catch in the North Atlantic. That's just in one farm. Huge farms, these. These are big, big production units, not some little independent operator. Big production units. And the aquaculture industry supports many of hundreds of jobs in the farming and processing in Fort William area alone. That's our local town. Many, many hundreds. New markets are being developed the whole time. This has been in the press a lot. I'm sure you've read about it. The Chinese market is coming in stream now. And there's all sorts of targets of expansion that are hopefully, well, the industry would like to meet. The licensing system, it does make it hard for the industry to identify new sites, even if they did want to relocate these ones. But that's certainly an argument that they would put up. And perhaps the most important one, and in a way I can't stress this enough, is this industry forms a key building block for rural self-sufficiency in the Scottish Government's plans for an independent Scotland. I believe that we are very, very small fry in all this, you know, and we have to keep a focus on that. Or I do as a manager anyway. So that's what we were faced with. I don't even need to say it, I don't think we're going to relocate the 17 fish farms in Loch Linnhe right at the moment. And if someone's got an idea how we're going to do that, can we speak later? So this is why we started to look at stocking to mitigate against that. So if we look at a standard stocking flowchart, which says to stay the salmon stock, well, okay, we've got rod catch, we've got one counter on the system, and that actually counts fish on a tributary. It's a fairly minor tributary, I have to say, but that has regularly recorded under 50% of the minimum spawning target for that tributary. It's never really gone above that. So we do know that we are certainly not at anything like our carrying capacity in the catchment. Is the river producing smolts at full capacity? Well, I think, showing the data I've just shown, we probably know that the estuary isn't, even if the river was. Is the cause of underproduction known? Well, one of the causes is, as I've just shown. Can the cause be removed? Can we remove the 17 fish farms? Well, this is when we diverge. I say no, we can't right at the moment. As a manager, I need to address that. So this is when we considered stocking for restoration. We follow this round. We set out a stocking strategy. We looked at the benefits. We looked at the risks. We came up with a proposal, and that's when we started stocking. So I'll just briefly. I did have nice little arrows to go. Would have made it a bit clearer. There we are. That's the logic, if you like, we followed in stocking the River Lochy. So which life stage to stock? That's the next question. I'll just go through this fairly quickly. We actually started with fed fry. About a gram long, gram weight, 2 centimetres long. They're 2 to 3 years in the river, so they're actually competing with what's already there. An immediate disadvantage in my mind. They're difficult to mark and then monitor the success of them, so we don't actually know, is the hatchery actually having any benefit? Again, in my mind, a disadvantage. But we were starting from a very, very low base at this point when we started fed fry stocking. And we did up to 500,000 every year between 2001 and 2009. All indigenous fish, I should stress that. We've never, in my time, stocked a non-indigenous fish into the River Lochy, or indeed any other river in Loch Harbour. But, of course, what we actually realised is we weren't actually addressing the problem. We'd identified the problem with the one of the major problems was clearly sea lice in the estuary on fish farms, but putting fry in the river wasn't addressing that. So that's when we moved on to looking at smolt. 45 grams in weight, 12 centimetres long. Now these guys are only 1 to 5 weeks in the river, obviously not competing with the natural populations in the same way at all. They're identifiable by an adipose fin clip. Now there's an immediate advantage, is we know automatically every fish that comes back from that program, we've identified it through a fin clip. And absolutely critically, and this is where we're maybe slightly different from other programs, is we can protect that fish with anti-sea lice medicine. So we can feed it with what's known as slice, and that gives it up to 6 to 9 weeks protection against sea lice infestation. And there's other advantages. It'll take an acoustic tag, take a pit tag, you can use it for research as well. So we started trial smolt releases in 2009. Now, what we did is we got together with some local companies. Sorry? Okay, I'll speed it up. We got together with local companies, principally Marine Harvest, who are our major operator in the catchment and our major funders. And we grow fry, just as we used to, in the hatchery. We then move those fry to a farm in Lochy, which is at the top of the Lochy catchment, into their farm. We have a dedicated cage that was donated by the net company you see at the top. And we then grow those on to pre-smolt. We move them back to the hatchery and we feed them with slice, because that's where we have the license. And then we stock the river from there with sliced smolts. Now, we took scientific advice from our fishery trust before we even started any of this. Quickly go through this. So the number of brood fish should be as high as practical without endangering the wild spawning population. Adult brood fish should be replaced every year. Stripping and fertilization should be carried out to maximize the diversity of the offspring and equalize the contribution of each adult to the eggs. We've already covered this today about covering, currently the bare minimum I will do is 3 cocks to a hen fish, but we try and actually create an absolute orgy in the hatchery if we have enough fish. And broodstock should preferably be sourced late in the year, as close as possible to the spawning areas, and their offspring released into the same river. And as an absolute bare minimum, this is what we follow and always have followed. However, we do accept that as our indigenous smolts are raised in a hatchery environment, they are ecologically different to their wild counterparts. Any future successes will have to be assessed against the trade-off and the risk to the long-term genetic fitness of the overall stock. And this goes back to this whole thing that's been covered already today about balancing out benefit against risk. And this is really, as a manager, what I'm constantly doing. Okay, some brief results. Okay, as I say, this has been a trial program up till now. I don't have a lot of results to show, but they do show something. 2009, we put out 18,000 smolts. The following year, we caught to the rods 21 grilse. 2 years later, 15 salmon. 36 rod-caught salmon from 18,000 grilse. We've used the 10% exploitation rate. I will say why in just a second. We reckon that's roughly 360 extra spawning salmon. So maybe what's that, 180 pairs perhaps, giving us just shy of 1 million eggs deposited. It's a marine survival rate of 2%. And it's actually increased the private bee rod catch by 9.7%. 2010, very, very similar results, to be honest with you. 2011, we did put fish out, but they were unmarked due to an event at the fish farm, and so I've taken them out of the figures. 2012, we've only had the grilse back so far from a 38,500 release, but 34 grilse back. If you follow that through, that's roughly in line. If we get 50% grilse, 50% salmon, it's roughly in line with our figures so far. So we're probably going to hit about a 2% marine survival rate again when we get the salmon back next year. Floy tagging, yeah, just very, very briefly, some people will say, well, you can't use 10% rod exploitation rate when there's other rivers have shown this 30%. Well, the reason we do that, we actually sort of tested our exploitation rate in a very sort of amateurish way, one may say, using the gillies, using floy tags. We just put out 30 wild rod-caught fish we floy tagged from spring right the way through to autumn, and we looked at the recapture rates. In both 2012 and 2013, we only recaught 1 of the 30 fish. Now, okay, that's not telling us a hell of a lot, but it's certainly telling us we're not catching fish over and over again. I was interested in some of the figures from the Karen there. It's not particularly surprising. This is like a motorway, this river. It's the bottom of a very, very large catchment. So this is one of the reasons why we used the 10% figure, why when we came to the estimation of the number of adults returning based on a rod catch, this is one of the reasons why we're doing that. But let's just summarize the returns. Approximate 2% of smolts come back to the river and approximately 0.2% back to the rods. Early indications are that for every 18,000 smolts we're putting out, we're boosting the rod catch by 10%. We're adding 1 million extra eggs to the system. Okay, I'm just going to let you read these because I know I'm getting short of time. Okay. We find at the bottom there, angler education on checking for fin clips have been critical. We actually think that this is probably under-reporting of what's actually been caught. Getting people to sort of get in the mindset of checking for them has been tricky. The Lochy's been catch and release for many, many years now. What a really nice byproduct of all this is actually we allow all fin clip fish to be killed. In fact, we encourage them to be killed, and that's gone down very, very well with the anglers. I would actually say it's renewed interest in angling in the catchment, that people can eventually take a fish home for the table, which as anglers, I'm sure the anglers in the room will understand the importance of that sometimes. Okay, fine, we've shown we can take fish back, we can bring fish back to the river. I think it was Peter Mantle in Delphi once said to me, it's not rocket science, John, you put smolts out there, they will come home in certain proportions, but they will come home. We've shown that, but what about cost analysis? Does it make financial sense? And this is maybe where the implications of what we've been doing you might consider in your own projects. And I think this is probably the important part of this talk, actually, so I'll focus on it a wee bit. Each Lochy salmon has approximate rental value of 300 quid. It's roughly, it's a crude figure. It's roughly what we can rent a salmon for. It's actually got a capital value of £6,000 as well. So now, I can't stress this enough. This programme is heavily subsidised by our partners in industry. Each smolt's costing us about 24 pence to produce. If you didn't have that subsidy, it'd be about 2 quid. Each extra returning spawning adult costs us about £12. If you didn't have that subsidy, it'd be £100. Each extra 1,000 over in the river costs about £4.80, be 40 quid without, and this is the important bit. Each extra rod-caught salmon, based on our figures, is costing us £120 to produce with all the subsidy. If you didn't have that subsidy, it's going to cost you 1,000 quid. Now, obviously, I would say it doesn't make any sense to produce something for 1,000 quid that you can rent for 300. That, I think, is one of the important things so far from our project. But has it actually done anything to the rod catch? Well, okay, there's the blue bit before fish farming and intensive inshore fishing. There's the red bit where we had the collapse. And here's where we actually signed up an AMA, and I haven't even talked about that because I don't have time. But that's when we actually got together with fish farmers and signed an area management agreement looking at the production cycles, looking at treating, looking at all this. It coincided with intensive stocking. We've seen a climb out of it, but as someone has already pointed out, that doesn't necessarily prove cause and effect. And importantly, since we started smolt stocking, you can see the last 3 years, 2013 is an estimation so far, it's not very impressive. You know, we haven't gone through the roof with this. You know, it's at these sort of levels of stocking, we haven't really made a great impact on the Lochy rod catch. I think that has to be said. So some key questions. Would we be operating a smolt program if we thought there was a realistic chance of removing the salmon farms? No, we wouldn't. Would a smolt program be a cost-effective tool, would it not, for the heavy financial assistance? Well, no, it certainly wouldn't. Has the smolt program been effective in mitigating against the effects of sea lice? Frankly, I'd have to say, as yet, not proven, to use that famous phrase. Do we feel, though, that the benefits of operating the smolt program outweigh the risks? Well, currently, in our circumstances, and looking at this potential 50% loss to sea lice, yes, we would like to keep it because we don't know what's going to happen with sea lice. And apart from anything else, you know, we can also use it for other things. And that's my final question. Do we feel that we can improve on the current program? Yes, and particularly with regards to research uses and new release strategies. And I only have 2 slides left, David, so don't worry, I am speeding up. Release strategies, this is my final point. I've travelled about a bit and very thankful some of them are in the room to my hosts in Ireland. And I was recently out in Norway looking specifically at smolt programs to look at best practice and how other people are doing it and what results they're getting. And one of the most impressive projects I've come across, and I think it's a shame that they're not speaking, but is the River Vosso in Norway. This is not one of these rivers that were affected by GS. This is a river that had the same impacts as we did: fish farming, predation, climate change, etc. And what they've done is they actually stopped angling completely. And they did limited smolt releases of 20,000 fish, and they put them in the river, and they found very, very little returns. And what they've done, completely different approach, if you like, is they took a limited period for 5 years. They increased smolt stocking dramatically. As you can see, the green lines there are smolt stocking up to 180,000. So that was from 20,000 smolts out to 180,000. And the idea was almost to sort of kickstart a recovery. And now they've completely pulled back, and they're just doing some research projects using smolts. That's why you see it continuing. But the results, you can't really... Now, that's the slide we don't have. That's annoying. The results are extremely impressive. Basically, the bagnet catch went from penny numbers, I think 10, 15 fish, to as soon as they took this different approach, and actually, sorry, I've missed out a crucial thing. What they did is, as well as increasing the numbers, they've towed their smolts past all the impacts in the estuary and released them on the seaward side. That's the critical point. The bagnet catch went from penny numbers of fish, 15 fish, to I think the most was 1,200 fish. Almost all from the programme. Limited angling was allowed this year for 5 weeks only, and 5 rods caught 384 fish, 90% of which were fin clipped from this programme. These are quite impressive results. I'm very, very interested in those results, especially in this idea of towing. And we're now looking at, for the Lochy, a similar approach, or at least looking at can we apply it in our own circumstances. So the priorities for us for the next 5 years is further develop ties with rivers like the Lochy, and we've actually in the process of setting up a European learning partnership programme to actually exchange information, research the relative importance of sea lice. Now, we know it's having an impact, but how much? And I believe the only way we can do this is looking at treated groups of smolts and untreated, and looking at their relative survival. Believe it or not, we have not actually shown that infestation of salmon smolts by sea lice has any actual impact on the adult population in rivers. It seems beyond belief we haven't shown it, but we haven't. And that work, I think, is the most important bit of work we need to do. And that's why we're talking to ROS, we're talking to ASFB, talking to other bodies about how we can put that project together, because we have the infrastructure and the ability to be able to do it. And all these other research things we now want to look at, using genetic tools and looking at other impacts, not just about sea lice, there's other things that we can use a smolt program to look at. But we also want to investigate the towing idea of moving them beyond the fish farms. And we'll finish on some fish porn, because I know there's a few anglers in the room. When you've got fish like this, the River Vosso, was world famous for the largest salmon in the world, and the River Lochy in days gone by certainly had some of the largest salmon in Scotland. There's Arthur Oglesby up there with a 40-pounder, and there's a 48-pound fish from the Lochy in 1910, I have to say. But that one with one of our gillies there, I remember that fish, that was just shy of 40 pounds. When a river can produce fish of this quality, I believe it's well worth saving. Thanks for your time.